I'm very much honored to have here with us tonight Laura Carvalho and Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid. Please, if you can come. So the first session will be on recent experiences of growth and distribution in Latin America. And it's a very interesting opportunity because we have with us two giant scholars of both countries, and both of them have great monographs on their country. So Laura Carvalho has a bestseller book on, as many of you may know, Valsa Brasileira, on the recent Brazilian experience, and as well Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid is a historian of Mexican economic history and has a book on development growth and the Mexican economy. So it's, I think for all of us, it's an honor to have such a great contribution tonight. Let's start with Laura, and she'll have half an hour, and then we can go for questions, and then we go to Juan Carlos. Where is it? Se você preferir ficar em pé, pode ficar.
Maybe I'll stand. I think it's late enough in the day that people may fall asleep if I'm sitting down. So thank you, Ricardo Suma, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, of course, not only at my alma mater and my home, but also, which is this institute, but also with among my fellow heterodox economists who I haven't seen as much in the past year or so after being on leave from the university. So it is, for both reasons, a pleasure, and it's also a pleasure to divide the panel with Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid, because I'm very interested in Mexico, and especially at this moment, we are all very curious to know what's going to happen in Mexico. So I think it's great that we have the chance to discuss not only the past, but maybe have some time during the discussion to think about the prospects we have in Latin America for development and growth. I will use the fiscal policy and inequality lens, let's say, to examine the experience of the past decade or so, more than a decade in Brazil. And I could have picked other lenses to look at this experience, but I think it would be too. We don't have enough time to go over all aspects of economic policy, and I thought that talking about fiscal policy is maybe one angle that, especially in a demand-led growth workshop, makes sense as a lens to analyze the Brazilian experience since the 2000s, as well as talk at the very end about the prospects we face and the constraints we face at the moment in this new wave, not only with the Lula government, but I would say a new wave of progressive governments in Latin America, but in a very different context, both on the fiscal and on the external side. So motivation for this, for those who are not familiar with the Brazilian data, of course, Brazil is one of the most unequal economies in the world. We know that. It's true for most of Latin American economies. It's even more so when we look not at the Gini index, but at the concentration at the top, right? This is what really characterizes our inequality. We have a big share that goes to the top 1%. And as other Latin American economies, Brazil was able to achieve a certain, let's say, reduction, some inequality reduction in the 2000s, while increasing and expanding economic growth. And these trends have quickly reversed since 2014. We can go back to the question of whether they have gone back or not to a trajectory. I think it's hard to say. But what I would like to do is ask the question of, first, how was it possible to combine inequality reduction and growth, and what were the limits of the process and the way we did it in the 2000s? What lessons do we take for inclusive growth narratives? Please. Oh, no, it's actually me who is on control. Okay, so what explains the combination of inequality reduction and growth? I think there are three main aspects related to fiscal policy in Brazil. The first, of course, is well known, is the cash transfer program. We can talk about how much you can achieve with social transfers. I think the experience in Mexico and the popularity that Obrador has, the same way as Lula in the first time, when you do it for the first time, you start expanding these cash transfer programs. You have not only significant impacts on poverty and inequality at the bottom of the distribution, but also huge political gains that are collected from this, right? And this is something that maybe you can do it once, maybe you can do it twice, but I'm not sure if you can do it so many times. And so we need to, that's one of the reasons I want to create a dialogue here. The second is minimum wage policy. And there I would say Lula, in both Lula and Dilma had significant real wage increases for minimum wage in particular, and these have led to a big reduction in the wage inequality components, but it also had an effect through fiscal policy, given that the minimum wage in Brazil, for those who are not familiar, is not only the floor for the labor market, the formal labor market, it's also the floor for social benefits. So part of the pensions, the non-contributory agriculture, rural pension, as well as some other social benefits are linked to the minimum wage. And so the minimum wage has a very important role here for inequality reduction. And the third aspect of fiscal policy that I think explains that experience is the expansion in public investment in general, and that not only due to the growth effects and how it affected labor markets in general, but in particular through the role it had for the construction sector in Brazil. So construction, of course, was one of the big beneficiaries of this era, and construction by nature is very labor intensive. In developing countries, it hires non-skilled labor, and so the demand for low-skilled workers actually was boosted by this policy and also played a big role in the distributive side, which sometimes is underestimated. People tend to look a lot at the minimum wage and the cash transfers, but in fact the social infrastructure and the public infrastructure investment and big expansion on that also played a role in the inequality reduction we had. The result of that was both an increase in the labor share, so the functional distribution had an improvement in this period, but also a reduction in the Gini index for wages, which in the total Gini means that you had a slight reduction, but as we'll see, very modest one, given that a lot of the inequality is explained from the difference between the top and the middle as opposed to the middle and the bottom, which is really what we tackled, right? So the minimum wage to average wage also increased significantly. So it was a reduction in inequality from between the middle and the bottom of the distribution. This is just to show how it happened in certain sectors. So basically, this had there is a structural transformation angle to this inequality reduction. So this is work from the master thesis of Clara Brank, who is sitting here, who we then published as a chapter, as well as a paper. And here we have some sectors of the Brazilian economy who really were the largest beneficiaries of these policies and these growth periods. Many of them have that characteristic that I was talking about, that is true for construction, but it's also true for some of the services. They are labor intensive, they hire a lot of low-skilled labor, and here what we see in the left is that for these sectors that were the winners of this process, the wages have increased relative to the wages in the other sectors of the economy. And again, in these sectors, jobs have grown relative to job creation in the other sectors. So these were beneficiaries, and they also explain some of this inequality reduction between wages. And of course, they're not manufacturing. And this is something I want to point here, because there is a challenge that we face, which has to do with how to combine inequality reduction and growth without or with an actual industrialization strategy, which is not what happened in this period. Well, most of you know the story of what happened since. I think here is a more simple story, like this period ended, some will say in 2011, some will say in 2014. Of course, there were changes in the policies in 2011. After President Dilma Rousseff takes office, there is a change in priorities. So, for instance, investment in infrastructure, which was a big driver of growth in the early 2000s, was not a big driver of growth since President Dilma Rousseff took office. It stagnated. But minimum wage policies and cash transfer continued to be important pillars of fiscal policy throughout the Workers' Party years. Since 2014, we reversed most of this. We had a big fiscal consolidation that started in 2015-16, but we can say that we've been now 10 years in that same fiscal consolidation in one way or another. It's been a decade of austerity in Brazil. Of course, this was even harder after the adoption of a spending ceiling that only allowed public spending to grow at the rate of inflation of the previous year, which lasted until last year. It was revised slightly. We can go back to that since the elections in 22. And then the result of this has been a rise in inequality that was 50% faster even than the reduction in inequality that happened in the 2000s. So we quickly reversed the gains that we had, right? And I think that's the big puzzle here, because on the one hand, we want to talk about the achievements, but also there was something about that process that was very easy to reverse, and some challenges that remained. So I put together a couple of pieces of evidence that I've worked on with different students over the years that can help understand some of this. So one is part of the work that Dante Cardoso and I have done on the effect of austerity measures from the spending and the tax side in South America and Latin America. And one aspect that distinguishes Latin America countries relative to OECD countries in this evidence is that if in OECD countries, the evidence, and I'm not only talking about Alesina and co-authors, a lot of the evidence, even the ones that question Alesina, still find something which is tax-based fiscal adjustment packages tend to be more contractionary than spending-based packages in the OECD country evidence. I mean, maybe there is something wrong with that evidence, but there is a lot of evidence pointing in that direction. For Latin America and South America, actually the opposite appears very clearly. Tax-based episodes are much less contractionary than spending-based episodes. And in addition to that, which is what we examine here, spending-based episodes are not only contractionary, but they also increase inequality very much, while tax-based episodes do not have a significant effect on inequality, at least the ones that we have in the sample, right? And the other piece of evidence that I want to bring here before starting the discussion is that also social benefits in Brazil have a big multiplier effect. And the evidence is that it even matches the multiplier effect of public investment. So social spending in Brazil has a more than one multiplier. And so the idea here is that this program that we had in the 2000s was a spending-based program that was able to reduce inequality but also boost growth. And these things were combined because the types of public spending that were boosted had a very large multiplier effect, also had a big effect on inequality reduction, and so you were able, through fiscal policy, to generate this situation, which is kind of rare for Brazilian history, of lower inequality and higher growth at the same time. Lessons from this spending-based, like from this fiscal policy-based agenda. I think social spending and public investment clearly are effective ways to reduce inequality between the bottom and the middle of the distribution. But there were also challenges that I think stayed from this period. The first is that it was very much relying on favorable external conditions. That's true for Brazil, and that's true for other Latin American economies in the period. We know that this is one of the themes of this workshop, the commodity price boom of the 2000s and its consequence for revenue, fiscal revenue generation, as well as balance of payments, has created the conditions to be able to have such a, let's say, an approach to this income distribution without engaging in any type of conflict, right? There was a clear win-win scenario where the situation, the fiscal situation and the external situation was comfortable enough for President Lula at the time to engage in this type of expansionary fiscal policy and still reduce public debt and still continue with the same type of politics that he usually has, and he wasn't engaging in a lot of conflict. So the distributive conflict was alleviated. It was also, the favorable external conditions allowed for an exchange rate anchor to play a big role in preventing this process from an explosive type of inflation trajectory. So there was, at the time, a consequence of this income distribution, which was services inflation accelerated as a result of the types of jobs that were created, the type of wages, the wages that increased. Of course, you saw a cost push wage services inflation accelerating during the 2000s, and the only reason it didn't pick up and it didn't become a higher problem, a larger problem, is that you had a very strong exchange rate appreciation on the other side, which managed to control inflation as a whole, right? And finally, you also avoided any type of trade imbalances, even without having any manufacturing, even without manufacturing being much stronger or big industrialization policies or anything of the kind. Still, your exports were doing fine because of price of commodities, and so there was no problem or a mounting problem in the balance of payments or in the trade balance, right? So there was a clear scenario there, or a context for this type of policies that I want to revisit in a second, because I don't think we have that same that same context anymore in this moment. But this is something that I think is for discussion. And the second or final limit of this process is that still you didn't have a reduction of inequality from the top to the middle, which is really where inequality is very dramatic in Brazil, right? So it was a process that was able to combine reduction of inequality and growth, but it didn't go to the major source of inequality in Brazil, which is the top to the middle, exactly because it didn't engage in the type of distributive conflict. It played with what was possible given the comfortable external scenario. This is just a figure to show how the share of top 1% even increased before tax. After tax, it remained kind of stable, but it even increased before tax during this period. I'll skip this, but we can go back to it. This is just a figure that shows how in Brazil we improved the redistributive side of spending, of public spending and transfers during this period of the 2000s, but we didn't improve anything in terms of the regressive tax system, right? There was no tax reform that did that. And here I want to point to a possible alternative. So an alternative to the type of spending-based inequality reduction that we had would have been or could be something that relies more on increasing taxation as a form of inequality reduction. And there is evidence indeed, this is more recent econometric work, also by Dante Cardoso in his PhD dissertation, that shows that indeed direct tax increases in direct taxes do not harm growth and have a reduction in inequality as a consequence. So there is a room, or there could be a room to do redistribution, and instead of, in a period where you have less comfortable fiscal conditions, not necessarily because of debt problems, but because of self-imposed fiscal rules or whatever, we can go back. We can have room for another type of fiscal policy, which in fact taxes at the top and redistributes to the bottom. And this has a potential multiplier effect as well. So this is evidence from a study on propensities to consume for different parts of the distribution in Brazil. And in fact, the propensity to consume at the bottom 50%, and the middle 40% is much higher than the propensity to consume at the top. I mean, there's no news for people working on this. I mean, I've done theoretical work on how that can, in a Kaleckian model, mean a stimulus to the economy, even when you don't have room in your budget for an actual fiscal expansion. It can be like a balanced budget type of multiplier. The problem is that we have huge political constraints also for this type of approach. We don't have a history. I mean, the history in Brazil has been of, instead, the tax system becoming more and more regressive. And every time you start discussing tax reforms, you see the same kind of resistance from elites that have a disproportionate influence in Congress, and therefore the space or the political space for doing this kind of strategy is also difficult. So it's not by chance that we haven't gotten there. So I'll use this last slide to try to start a conversation about what the prospects are at the moment. So the first key aspect is that we have less. I'm not saying we have a very difficult international scenario. I don't think we're facing a crisis, even though this seems to be changing as we speak. But it's not like we are in the worst external scenario. in terms of commodity and commodity prices. There is still traction in commodities that could make Brazil and other Latin American countries avoid any type of external constraint. I don't see like a clear balance of payments constraint at the moment, but this is something for us to discuss. However, we also don't see a commodity price boom of the kind we experienced in the 2000s that brings the dynamic and the growth in tax revenues that we had in that period. We don't see the fiscal situation improving just from the external side, right? So the win-win scenario of the 2000s, where you can increase public spending while reducing public debt without any kind of effort on the tax side, doesn't seem likely, at least not from the current scenario. Government spending is also constrained by fiscal rules. In the case of Brazil, there is a new fiscal rule. It's not a spending ceiling of the same kind. It's a hybrid rule that has a spending ceiling, which is now 2.5% growth, but it's also attached to tax revenues. And so there is a way by which, if revenues increase, you are able to increase spending, but to a certain limit. And so it's a complex rule, and it still limits very much the capacity to spend of the government. So the constraint to fiscal policy is much higher than in the past, because even if you do have a favorable condition that leads to higher tax revenues, you can never get anywhere close to the type of expansion of fiscal of government spending that we saw in the 2000s, anywhere close. So we saw public spending growing at more than 7%, 8% in several years during that period, and now 2.5 is the highest possible growth rate. Moreover, even raising taxes, which would be the solution, is proving difficult, not only in Brazil, but I think not by chance. All the governments, the new wave of progressive governments in Latin America, all of them have tried or proposed tax reforms right at the beginning, because all of them faced the same type of change in conditions than in the 2000s that required such efforts. And in all these, there was a frustrated attempt. Colombia managed to approve tax reform, but a much more modest tax reform than what was proposed at the beginning. So at the moment, the role of taxation, which could be important, it doesn't seem like we have a lot of room for it. In Brazil, we started the discussion, and so far we haven't seen any proposal reaching Congress, because obviously the political conditions for approving such a thing are almost zero at the moment. And finally, I think when it comes to then the future prospects, it would need to be there would need to be a growth strategy or a growth agenda that alleviates these conflicts, that is more domestically grounded. And maybe one of the pathways that other Latin American economies are discovering are the sort of green industrialization agendas and the new waves of industrial policies that take advantage of climate transitions. I think in the case of Mexico, for example, this seems to be what the new government is talking about, but we remain to see. But so far, I mean, we haven't seen anything really promising in this area either. So this is kind of what I wanted to leave us with. I know it's not a very optimistic note, but I think in a demand-led growth model, when demand is missing and we don't see any sources of demand out there, I would like to leave for the audience. I mean, if you know a source of demand, let us know, because we're looking for one. Thank you.
So, Thank you very much, Laura. Since I have the mic, I think I will have 2 questions myself, but then you can also start lining up for the next questions that will have to be done here. Yeah. I have one question which is pretty much related to the conference theme, and which is like the critics of the well, progressive taxation will always point that, well, it will lead to capital flights, depreciation, inflation, and then maybe it will have negative distributive outcomes. How would you answer this kind of critic? And another question would be, okay, I think it's very, very valuable to focus on taxation and not so only on spending. But then, what is your take on the long-term effects on the growth rates of arising from this taxation? Do you think it will, in the long term, taxing the rich in the case of Latin America or Brazil will lead to higher growth rates, or it's just a one-time effect? I don't know, maybe we can collect a couple, 2 questions and then we do 2 or 3 questions and then we do another round. I see Guilherme.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation, Laura. Since you mentioned the new fiscal policy rule, I have a question more on your opinion and your, I don't know, about the political sustainability of this rule, because currently there must be, at least I've heard, there must be a conflict between the existing constitutional floors for obligatory spending on education and health and the dynamics of this rule in the next years. But on the contrary to the previous rule, this is not constitutional rule, so it's based on a law, so there might be the possibility of changing. So how do you see that? Thank you.
Well, Laura, my point is more of a comment maybe and a compliment. I believe that, I totally agree with your diagnostic, and I believe that your second item there is the way to move from the present slow growth that we have. And I see a great coherence in that, because even though you said that in OECD may not be like that exactly, this favorable lower impact of tax improvements, tax increases, if progressive, makes total sense in a more unequal society, right? And be it for propensity of consume, the ultra-rich, of course, are not affected. And another aspect which I have been thinking about is that it's also a way to make it compatible to have an improvement in social equality and a promotion of investment. So if we think that, in a way, we want to boost both profits and social expenditure, the way or the place where to tax is the rich people. And I think that this discussion may be blocked by a poor economic debate in Brazil. For example, we have seen opposition to taxation of dividends, whereas dividends, although are received from profits, it's the difference between profits that remain in the company for future investments and profits that go to the individual rich owner of the company, so to say, right? And so I think that this is the way through, because I'm not also very optimistic in terms of public spending on deficit, but public spending on taxation on those areas in which taxation would not be economically harmful, I think is the way to go through.
Thank you, Lara. Fantastic presentation. So, I'm from Chile, so I know very little about Brazil. So I was just wondering about the labor market angle of this story, right? So obviously you talked about the minimum wage. I was wondering, what was the state of the labor market during these years? Was the unemployment rate, was the labor market very tight or not? If it was tight, do you think it contributed to some low-skilled wage growth, right? I think this is, as you probably know, a hot topic in the United States because we're finally seeing wage inequality go down. It is true we have had a little bit of a Green New Deal, but we're running one of the tightest labor markets, and unions have, in the auto industry and in other industries have been substantially reformed and are conducting very ambitious campaign, right? We have some of the biggest union wins in the past year. So yeah, so I was wondering if you could comment on that, and I guess related to that is, should we be so afraid of an increase in distributive conflict if there's an increase in union militancy? Because, I mean, I think one of the points of not all this controversial, right, in Keynesian economics, but if you attain a higher wage through distributive conflict, this might not be so bad for the economy, right? So I was wondering if you could expand on that point, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So let's start with, I'll put together a couple of the questions. So the first, on the role of taxation, and maybe I didn't make myself that clear. I think when I was discussing the role of taxation, it's not as a source of growth in itself, obviously, but it's given the scenario and given the less comfortable external and fiscal conditions, even if self-imposed fiscal rules, one of the solutions for this new era would be to tax and spend, as opposed to just spend. Because before you had like a source of growth of tax revenues that was external, and that had a lot to do with the commodity price boom. And so taxes were growing because of economic growth itself, as well as because of the commodity price boom, and that allowed the government to spend a lot more. Since this source of growth of taxes is not there, then taxing the rich and spending would be one way. I'm not saying that you need, I don't want to create a fight with any MMT lover here. Like, I'm not saying that you need to tax before you spend. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that given the fiscal rule that has been approved in Brazil, that actually attaches the amount of spending that you can have to your tax revenues, then you don't have much of a choice. You need tax revenues, and they need to come from somewhere. So my evidence here was more to say that in that case, if you do that by direct taxes on the rich, then it's not harming growth, and it's potentially generating a distributive effect if you then spend on the other side without, in a balanced budget multiplier type of way. So no, I don't think taxes have a long-term effect by itself, but they could potentially grow over time, and if spending grows over time with it, then it's something. But it is one-off if you think about a tax reform. I mean, if in the level, it's in some way it's one-off, but every year you would still be collecting more taxes and increasing that possibility. And if you spend, you generate growth through spending, which itself generates more taxes, and maybe that can have a dynamic effect. I don't want to say it's a long-term effect, but at least in the medium term, I think it is a possible strategy. And that, I think, relates to what Demian was saying, as well as one of the first questions. On the new fiscal policy rule, I can't see people, so I'll still stand again. On the new fiscal policy rule, the political sustainability of it, Guilherme, I think there was a smart move, which relates to the positive side of having conflict. Because when you don't have conflict, you don't even create the incentive to actually engage in the conflict on the side you want to favor, right? But because there was a conflict, and because the spending ceiling of the past had created had put all the pressure on the spending side, I think there was a smart move in the original design of this new fiscal rule, which was to put the conflict towards the tax revenue side. And I think that's the piece of the new fiscal rule that I like, at least in terms of how the economic policy debate has been shaped. It has only been shaped towards spending for many years, for a decade, and the new fiscal rule for creating that link to taxation, to revenues, at least created some incentive for discussing taxes. The problem is that this was not enough given the political situation. It became clear immediately that the government does not have the political space to increase taxes on the rich or on the sectors that have been beneficiaries of previous tax exemptions and that without any economic justification, right? So immediately, the first time they tried to put something to Congress, you saw almost a political crisis emerging, right? So there is, the level of inequality in Brazil, I think, also prevents, in a dramatic way, any attempt of increasing taxes. And in that sense, it's politically unsustainable because, of course, it relies on something, which is taxation. And at the same time, taxation is politically not viable at the moment. It does seem so. Unless we create that viability, it doesn't seem like the government has good chances of collecting more taxes. And so in that scenario, we're back to something very similar to the context of the spending ceiling. And the limits to growing spending is really, really low. And you're back to the same type of conversation about constitutional floors and links to minimum wages and all these different spending social benefits pieces. So in the end, it didn't work, let's say. It was an attempt that didn't work. And therefore, it creates a big problem for the government, and maybe we will abandon it. I don't know. I think that's the best case scenario. We abandon it. The worst case scenario is we keep it at the moment. So then Alejandro from Chile. Yes, we had a tight labor market in that period, and especially in those sectors that I showed, so very labor-intensive sectors, that helped explain indeed the wage growth for low-skilled labor, and you did see the type of wage inequality reduction that you are seeing in the US now, or even in the pre-pandemic years that also had a tight labor market. The consequence of that, and that's a great thing, I'm not saying that it's bad in any way, like if in any moment I gave the impression that I don't like distributive conflict, I don't think there was any kind of moral judgment of it. It's just that Lula doesn't seem to like distributive conflicts. Like we have a president that doesn't like a lot of conflict. He has another approach to politics, which is to try to engage everyone in the process and in the gains, right? And so for somebody like Lula, a tight distributive conflict is not the best scenario. I think the win-win scenario is something that he feels more comfortable with in terms of the room of maneuver, right? So there, in that moment, I think when labor markets became really tight and you started to see an inflation coming out of, a services inflation coming out of it, and the conflict emerging and being exacerbated, you started to see a lot of backlash from elites in Brazil. The impeachment of President Rousseff came after that. So it's hard to deal with conflict when you're in a highly unequal society. That's it, I think. I think I answered all. Thank you.
I think we can go for Juan Carlos, and then maybe we have a final conversation in the end.
Thank you, please.
So now... So we'll have Professor Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid, who is Professor of Economics at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma UNAM, Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, y he will be speaking about the Mexican economic quest for development under AMLO. who is also someone who likes coalitions, maybe, right?
Maybe. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here, really, and to speak with, after Laura, it's a lot of pressure, actually. And, well, what can I do? Just enjoy it and go for the ride. The Mexican economy quest for development under AMLO. AMLO is our president who loves conflict. He lives by conflict. He loves fighting every day. With lots of people, I voted for him. And thank you for inviting me. The Not So Young Scholars Initiative, I'm part of that, the Not So Young. So thank you very much. Let's start from the very beginning as Mary Poppins would like to say. This is from Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, etc., etc. This was written by Charles Dickens when he was comparing London and Paris and the French Revolution. It could have been written yesterday, speaking about Mexico. It depends on who you talk to, members of my family. Some say that, wow, this is great, and I say, wow, this is hell. Anyway, very conflictive impressions of what's happening in Mexico. So this is Charles Dickens, and it could be a description of Mexico today. The background, and actually this is well, it doesn't look very well, but that's the Doors of Hell by Rodin. The thinker is right up there. I don't know whether we go on this side of the Doors of Hell, on the other side of the Doors of Hell. I really don't know, but I like the picture, so anyway. Well, just for the ones that are not very familiar with Mexico's history, Mexico for 30 years, well, for a lot of years, followed a strategy of, well, here's Ricardo Bielchowski, by the way, industry-led, state-led industrialization, and we did great, but then in the 1980s, I was in Cambridge, and a friend told me, oh, Mexico is in the front page of the Financial Times. And I was very proud. I said, wow, Mexico in the front page of the Financial Times. It would just declare default on our debt. So every time that Mexico is in the page of any paper, sports papers, in fact, I couldn't care less if Mexico is in any page. So anyway, what happened is, at that time, there was a political change, and change also in economic paradigm in Mexico and in the rest of the world. So we moved from that state-led industrialization to market reforms, or you may call it neoliberalism. The idea was to put stability at the center of the discourse, and then stability by itself, basically with an open economy and with a state that's going to be reduced and more reduced ever in its intervention in the economy, would lead us to nirvana. And that was going to be sufficient for growth. And at the end, exports did boom, but weak investment. I mean, for 30 years, that neoliberalism didn't produce the miracle that it was supposed to produce. So poverty increased. We kept on in this trap of slow growth, slow employment, persistent and unacceptable levels of poverty and inequalities, and we still don't have, we're 120 million Mexicans, and we still don't have 11 that play good football at the level that you play in Brazil, so that's another. This is, forget it. I mean, and on top of that, Presidente Peña Nieto, who was the antecessor of López Obrador, was famous for corruption. I mean, there was really horrible scandals. So after 30 years of economic failure, social failure, political failure, then comes López Obrador with what he calls the fourth transformation. The reform, the independence, and the revolution were the previous three transformations. Now we're into the fourth one. The pillars of that fourth T, the 4T, we call it agenda, is the poor first. You have to end corruption. You have to bury neoliberalism. The poor first sounds great. I mean, to be frank, none of our previous presidents said that the poor are going to be last. But it was a great idea. So the poor first, yes. End corruption, it was, I mean, we're up to here of corruption for many, many reasons. And he said that at the bottom of everything is neoliberalism. Actually, neoliberalism is the cause of poverty, and neoliberalism is the cause of corruption too. So we have to get rid of we have to move into the demise of liberalism. But now food for thought, for a lot of thought actually. Well, the poor first, what does that really mean? What policy mix achieves and sustains a reduction of poverty through growth and redistribution, wage-led, profit-led, whatever you make, and the super multiplier, I'm sure that could respond to that, but I'm not going to deal into that. the premises of López Obrador are these. Any social demand not related to poverty alleviation in the short run is considered a distraction from the real issue. And that means gender, environment, animals, whatever you want. It's a distraction, and that's the way he has acted. Poverty is the root also of organized crime. So when you talk about the real problem of Mexico is poverty. Any money that the state has should be dedicated directly to the poor, to alleviate poor in the short run. AMLO he has also said that, AMLO was chosen by the people. He incarnates the will of the people. Yo ya no me pertenezco, I don't belong to myself, I belong to the people. I'm just quoting him. Thus, any opposition by the legislative or judicial powers, actually electoral regulating agencies, NGOs, civil society, middle classes, UNAM, the place I work, every opposition to any of his decisions are considered or is considered against the people. So this is very, very important. So because what he says is what the people wants. And the legislative is actually doing whatever he says. Whenever he sends a plan or an act, whatever, he's very proud, and the legislative is also very proud, not to even alter a comma, a semicolon. They say this was approved without a comma being changed. So where's the independence of the legislative power and the executive power? There's no independence now. Again, he said another thing, which is justice is above the law and also above markets. Who defines justice? Who defines justice? Well, the president, not the judge. So the independence of the judicial power is also in question. Now the main course, end corruption. How do you end corruption? The premise is that basically all previous governments in Mexico, especially past and present judges, are corrupt. The NGOs are also corrupt. The public sector is a source, that's what he says. It's a joke because you don't live there. Come and live in Mexico. The public sector is a source of privileges and corruption. He described El Estado as a rheumatic pachyderm, as an elephant that has rheumatism. So there is no need for fiscal reform, actually. He says in a Reagan style, was it Reagan or Bush? Reagan, I think, read my lips, no more taxes. It was Bush. Father, sorry, there have been so many ones that don't like taxes, so I tend to confuse. It could be AMLO. So there's no need for fiscal reform, as if you eradicate corruption, then you liberate the necessary resources to do whatever you want. So he said no tax reform in the first 3 years, and actually no tax reform in the whole 6 years. The people are honest. That's very important. The military are uniformed people. Therefore, and those two, they're very honest. There's no need to have open licitations of public projects. Moreover, the execution of key projects and their financial information is a matter of national security, and many of the key projects of investment and infrastructure are carried out by the military now. The military are now in charge of the customs unions. I mean, the role of military now in the economy is very, but to me, frightening. It has increased very much, and for AMLO, they're honest people, and they are doing what they have to do, and they do it in a very good way. So therefore, all the financial information on those projects is considered a secret, a national security. So you can't have access. So when they ask me, well, what's the rentability or the profit rate of the Tren Maya or the new oil refinery? Who knows? We don't have the data, and we won't have the data for the next 5 years or 10 years, more like that. And finally, the dessert. What do we really mean by the demise of neoliberalism? In Mexico, neoliberal and populist have become adjectives, not nouns. So if I don't like Mr. Robert, who I like very much, I will call him a populist. Or if whatever, it depends on the side that you are insulted as a neoliberal or insulted as a populist. So with my friend, what we decided, well, since we don't really know what he means by neoliberal in technical terms, what we found out is neoliberal is whatever he doesn't like. Whatever was done before is neoliberal. So we said, well, let's look at the policies. Are they neoliberal? Are they very different? I mean, since he's a non-neoliberal president. So then we looked at them, and trade policy, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was replaced by the USMCA, which is an agreement with the United States. And for López Obrador, he said that that was a priority. Actually, before he was moved into power officially, he appointed a special delegate to work with President Peña Nieto's team in order to guarantee that the USMCA was going to take place. So it was a priority for him. The trade policy, identical. It's even worse now in terms of neoliberalism, if you want, than what it was before. Industrial policy is inexistent. There were two attempts. The first attempt was the only one that it's interesting because it had a beautiful name. The name was Prosecco. If you like that wine, it was great. I mean, but that was the only thing. It lasted. It was never actually enacted. The minister was removed and placed into the National Statistics Office. And the next attempt at industrial policy, the minister was sacked. So there's no industrial policy. So what's different between trade policy and industrial policy of the previous regimes and AMLO's? They're just the same. Labor policy, that's really interesting. It's a progressive reform, actually pushed by the Trans-Pacific Partnership program, whatever, and the USMCA. Also, they said that Mexico wouldn't be accepted in the TPP or TPP. It's this agreement with China, etc., with East Asia, or the USMCA, if we didn't modernize our labor laws and regulations. The ILO had described Mexico's rules, labor laws and regulations, practically as middle-aged, 18th century ones. We're really among Afghanistan, with all due respect to Afghanistan and all places like that. But we were considering in that time that we needed to modernize that. So we, large minimum wage increases, outsourcing regulation, trade unions modernization. A difference between Mexico and Brazil, as Laura was explaining to me. In Mexico, the minimum wage is not linked to pensions. So you can do whatever you want. Actually, I work with Santiago and other friends in a small team, not with Peña Nieto, but with the previous regime, on modernizing all the rules related to minimum wage, because minimum wage was related to fines, to everything in life. It was not a policy of labor, it was a policy of many other things. So we managed to delink the minimum wage, and then López Obrador, that was really great. He did that. Fiscal policy, we have something which is called the Republican austerity. He calls it the Republican austerity. And he says that if things go really bad, then we go from Republican to Franciscan austerity. You laugh because you don't live in Mexico. Anyone else that laughs is going, I'm going to... Huh? Argentina, you don't laugh. You don't laugh. Yeah. It's very different when you swim with a shark and when you see the shark in a zoo, whatever, in an aquarium. He says there cannot be a rich government with poor people. Therefore, you cannot spend very much if you have a crisis, if you have an external shock. Then what you have to do is you have to tighten your belt. Macroeconomics 101, it's just thrown out of the window. So, in addition, he doesn't like debt, he doesn't like taxes. He says counter-cyclical operations are necessary and induce corruption, because then you are going to give money to enterprises and to entrepreneurs who actually are very rich. So why would they need money in the case of a shock like the COVID shock? So no need for things like that. Social policy, he changed, as Laura was saying. We had an old transfer schemes, conditional cash transfers. He also considered that those were corrupt. So he had to change, or he changed them for other forms of transfers. Now, show and tell policies, performance. Well, monetary policy, it's just the same. Not the same people, but it's the same institution doing the same things, with as Santiago presented before. Inflation targeting continues, and a very restrictive monetary policy. We have, I think it's with Brazil, one of the the largest real interest rates. We haven't reduced the rate. So monetary policy very restrictive, and it's the same monetary policy than before. Currency appreciation, López Obrador, he says that he wakes every morning and the first indicator that he looks at is, guess what? Inequality, poverty? No, the exchange rate, the nominal exchange rate. And he's very proud to have a super peso. Super peso, you know what super means, and peso, you know. So he's very proud of that, and he says that that's a proof of the strength of the Mexican economy. He doesn't know about carry trade operations, but he thinks that the peso is very good for us. And now you don't laugh, because now you have a currency appreciation too. And Republican austerity in practice. Florencia was asking in another of our sessions, how does Mexico do with this fiscal rule that you cannot spend unless you have the money to spend? Well, that's in form, but not in reality. As you can see, this is 2009, 2010. This is in 2009. We had our first really experience of counter-cyclical policy with Felipe Calderón, another president. And then with López Obrador, I mean, this is the time of López Obrador from 2018. So, I mean, spending has come up, and the austerity is more in the revenue side. I mean, they keep on taxing the same proportion of GDP, and what comes as austerity, if you look at the figures, it's actually a recomposition of spending. It's not that actual spending has gone down, but it has, López Obrador has shifted priorities in order to promote 3 or 4 projects and transfer and social transfers. So in addition to, this is the primary surplus, and then it became a deficit, and this is what it's forecasted for 2024, for the present year. So in 2020, in the pandemic, we were the only country in Latin America that had a primary surplus. In 2019 and 2020, the only country, because López Obrador said the pandemic was tailor-made for Mexico, for Mexico's fourth transformation. Because he had to trim public expenditure. What better opportunity to do that if you don't believe in counter-cyclical policy? So we do that. And then now, in 2024, when we have actually an expansionary phase of the economy, now we're going to have an expansion of the deficit in 2 or 3 points. So we're really very pro-cyclical in our fiscal policy. And the promise is that the fiscal deficit is going to be cut in 3 points next year, when we're going to enter a slowdown. Who knows what's going to happen with the US economy? As you were saying, things look all right, unless you read the paper, and then who knows what happens, right? And labor policy, in my view, the only step away from neoliberalism. We had an 100% increase in minimum wage in these years. Average wages increased only increased 20% in real terms. There's a big difference. How long can this continue? That's a great question that Laura posed, because this is the minimum wage, okay? This is productivity, and these are unit costs. So unit costs are going up, not as fast as the minimum wage. Obviously, productivity has been declining for a long time. So how long can you keep increasing the minimum wage when the minimum wage is already approaching 45% of the average formal wage? Experts on minimum wage, applied economics, say that, well, you really never know when the increase in the minimum wage is going to start really biting the average wage. But if you get close to 50, 60%, there's a sort of consensus that things may get ugly. López Obrador, in fact, has pushed a reform for the next, not generation, for the next sexenio, saying that the minimum wage should increase at the same rate of inflation. So now he himself, or his team, actually accepts that the minimum wage cannot double again in purchasing power. So this is problematic. So those are the policies. And so now, where do we stand? Our scorecard in the pandemic is really awful. We are among the first 5 countries in the world with more excess deaths. You know, the excess deaths of the pandemic is not the number of deaths, but well, it's an indicator of how badly we did in social policy. You calculate the number of deaths that have to normally occur in a certain year, and then you see what happened in the pandemic, and then you subtract. Because if you start just asking how many people died of COVID, some people don't even know. Some people don't want to say that they died. And some didn't die of COVID, but because they died because they didn't have an operation, because the operation room was just closed, et cetera, et cetera. So we're among the 5 worst countries in the sense of excess deaths. We're also among the top countries, or the worst countries, in our speed of recovery from the pandemic. So López Obrador had promised to make history. He said, vamos a hacer historia during the pandemic. And in a certain way we did. We are really bad in the health department and really bad in the economic recovery. So, and well, in addition, we are top of the world in the number of physicians and medically related personnel that died in the pandemic. So a very, very bad case. But on the bright side of the story, this is poverty, and this is extreme poverty. There was a 5-point reduction in poverty, but extreme poverty didn't decrease. Extreme poverty actually rose a little bit. Interesting enough is that the official data, official calculations of the government say that 80% of the reduction in poverty is due to the minimum wage rise, 80%. So great, 80% managed to reduce poverty to about 30% or something like that, so we need more than 30 points to go. But it means that transfers, all these hallowed, etc., transfers aren't doing their job, as one could expect, or as, for example, compared to the experience of Brazil. Because if you look at extreme poverty rose. In extreme poverty are people that don't really receive wages as such. 65% of the people that are employed in Mexico do not have a wage that is able to sustain the life of he or she. And they kid, I mean, one wage, supposedly, Mexican families are supposedly composed of 4 people, so one wage must be able to sustain 2 people. And for 60% of the employed people, even though the minimum wage has increased, since they don't receive a wage as such, I mean, not a 24-hour, 40-hour wage, so we are really bad. And in addition, social vulnerabilities, when I'm getting to that, increased. What those social vulnerabilities mean? Well, Mexico's social minister measures what are we doing in education, health services, in social security, housing, etc. So access to health services, the people that didn't have access to health service in the first year of López Obrador were 16% of the population or families. That rose to 39% of the population. So on the one hand, you say, wow, poverty was reduced, but on the other hand, 20% more of the population don't have access to health as they had before. This means that 50 million people are now in vulnerability in health. That's 30 million more, or 20 million, yeah, 30 million more than what they had in 2018. So you can say, well, great, many are, well, 5% are not so poor, but what's happening then? Well, there's a privatization of health. Because, I mean, since they don't have access, it means that they are not formally affiliated to any type of health or social security institution. So who has to pay? Well, purse money to pay for health has increased very, very much. There has been a scarcity of medicines, lack of vaccines. I'm not talking about the COVID vaccines. I'm talking about normal vaccines, you know, polio, etc. No? So we are in that. And, well, physicians too. But then let's go to transfers. Well, public expenditure in social development increased. These just look at the size of the columns. I mean, this increased, say, like, I don't know, 30%, something like that. This per capita, right? And social expenditure is here. But then expenditure on, say, on economic matters declined very, very much. It rose, when you look at as a proportion of GDP, well, it doesn't look that great. It rose one point of GDP. It was 4.0, it went to 5.0. It rose, it's okay, but it's not that massive. I don't know the figure, the per capita figure for Brazil. But the awful part of it is the distribution of the transfers. Because before the conditional cash transfer, they were conditioned to the poor. One question whether the focus was doing okay, the targeting, et cetera, et cetera. But now we see that in 2018, people, the first 3 deciles received 53% of all the money that was being transferred in social purposes. The poorest 3 deciles received it. Now they receive 35%. If you look 15, 11, 9, 9, 9, 9, 10, 9, it's evenly distributed, more or less. So more money to the poor, yes, as a percent of GDP, well, it's much more regressive than it used to be. So no wonder that the transfers as such are not doing their job. What about employment? Well, employment, we're supposed to generate, or the idea was we're going to need to generate 1 million jobs a year. In no year of the AMLO's administration have been able to get close to 750,000 jobs. We're about in 500,000 jobs. So, and the expected annual variation for next year is equally bad. Economics, well, inflation is, forget about it. GDP, the forecast is that we won't have an inflation problem. The forecast is that we won't have a foreign exchange problem or a exchange rate problem. But, I'll get to the but after, because the presidential election gave some results that are, well, at least eyebrow rising. This is GDP per capita. So, bless you. It all happened to me. I start sneezing when I see the GDP per capita figures. I'm rather allergic. So this is like, putting in your terms, this is like wage-led redistribution and stagnation. So I don't know the cause, but it is, you see, we are at lower than 2018 GDP per capita. And worst of all is that the expected, the Banco de Mexico, or central bank, carries out this survey among the people that, the experts on macroeconomics in Mexico, has been doing it for years. And, well, in January 2021, they asked them what is going to be the average rate of growth for the next 10 years. And for the next 10 years, they asked the same question. And look at this. This is like, in Mexico, we have something called Quetzalcoatl, which is the plumed serpent, the feathered serpent. That serpent used to fly. It doesn't fly anymore. So it's just like dormant there. 2% per year average annual rate of growth for the next 10 years. AMLO promised 4%. Yeah, forget about 7, 5, etc. And this is what is expected. So 2% is way below what we need. We need at least to generate the jobs in order not to deteriorate more the labor market. So let's go to investment. Investment increased in this administration less of a point of GDP. And actually it increased in the last year. This is very important because when you look at average rates of growth, geometric rates of growth, you have 1 point here and you have 1 point here. What happens in the middle, it doesn't really matter, because to calculate that average geometric rate of growth, you take these two. But when the variable that you measure is the accumulation of capital, it's not the same to have an investment rate that is like this and then grows 1 year, than to have an investment rate that is like this, grows like this, and then is stagnant, because accumulation of capital, okay? So what happened is that basically, all these years that actually investment declined are not, the deterioration of capital as such, capital, okay, is not, I don't think it's being replaced or recovered, etc., with this boom in investment in 2023. What was the reason of that boom in investment in 2023? My hypothesis is that after 6 years or more than 6 years, because the decline in investment or the slowdown of investment has been going on for some years, after those years, and with a real exchange very, very appreciated, some businessmen decided it was time to, buy those machines and replace the ones that were before. This is just a hypothesis, I don't know. The elections were coming soon, and there was the idea that perhaps there could be, a sort of hiccup on the exchange rate, so why not buy the machines? But I'm not able to prove that. What I'm able just to show you is that the figures of investment, there was 5%, 6%, 4, 0.1, 0.0. So that huge soar of investment is over. We don't see that investment anymore. This is the public investment. Look at this. Even public investment is going down. These are the figures for the first term of this current year. And private investment too is slowing down. So initially, a few months ago, one would say, wow, finally investment picked up. Now you look at the figures and you say, well, it picked up and then it stopped picking up. And this is actually awful, because this is the period of state-led industrialization. And the figure of capital per employee or productivity per employee, you actually don't see any change in AMLO. The figures, both of them are nothing to brag about. And productivity, why would productivity increase if the ratio of K to L? I know there are many, many problems in measuring it, but if you give me an alternative, as you want a source of demand, give me an alternative and I'll apply it, very happy. Our trade balance, we used to be, now that I was so envious hearing Laura, because Laura says, let's have a commodity boom. And in Mexico we say, no, please no, let's not have a commodity boom. We export automobiles and we import commodities. We are not an oil economy anymore, so please not have an economy boom. The problem with Brazil and Mexico is that they used to say that Mexico is very close to the United States and far away from God. You are very far away from the United States, and I don't know about God, but that's another point. But this is the non-oil trade balance, and this is the oil trade balance. Exports last year, what, 4 minutes? Yes. Oh, yes. Well, export actually in 2023, because of the exchange rate so appreciated, were not a source of growth for the economy. Actually, they shrunk the economy. They slowed down the economy. But now we have nearshoring. As we used to have NAFTA, now we have nearshoring. So you talk to lots of people, Mexico nearshoring. And well, what is it? You know what's nearshoring? And we brag, or the government brags, that Mexico is now the leading exporter to the United States. That's great. But the only problem is that, where's that nearshoring? The figures of nearshoring are non-existent in the sense of new investment. These are the figures. This is actually the Federal Reserve of the United States. And the blue columns are new investment. The others reinvested profits. So actually, it has just vanished. We don't have new investment. When you look at the figures of overall foreign direct investment, which includes reinvested profits by the same firms, well, yeah, there's an increase. But you look at new investment and the figure of new investment, and look at this, and you have to go back, I don't know, 10 years, 20 years to have such a low figure. Reinvested profits are great, but is there any structural change with the Ford company investing in the same plants, or with other companies like that? Two frank structural changes out of the picture with no industrial policy as such. Moreover, as a proportion of GDP, FDI has decreased, has not increased recently, has decreased. So where's the nearshoring? Well, the nearshoring, the cited evidence of all the studies is conversations. Actually conversations. You know, you look at Facebook, oh, how many times they're talking about nearshoring? Well, it has increased, and boom, so nearshoring is booming in Mexico. Or the price of land related to industrial park. Yes, that has soared, the price of land, but where's even Tesla was the spearhead of that new nearshoring, has said that, well, who knows whether Tesla is going to invest, because they are they have problems on their own, but also we have energy problems in Mexico, water problems in Mexico. So in general, the perception is that something will happen soon, someday, soon, who knows. Another difference between Mexico and you is that we always think that we're going to get to the 5th game of the World Cup. We are always going to get to the 5th. Your problem is getting to the final and winning the final, and you do win the final from time to time, but we're not anymore. It's been a while, but in our case, it's been more than a while. So we're different. So in summary, moderate poverty, in summary, is that there have been, as you can see, the good part, I don't think it can be continued. The reduction in poverty was due to the minimum wage increase, which was massive. Can it go at such speed? Not even López Obrador says that it can be repeated. The pensions, well, didn't do their job, but now they are supposed that you increase them. How are you going to increase them without fiscal reform? Right now, the amount of government that's going to go to pensions is more than the amount of VAT that is being collected. So pensions are the picture, and the minimum wage is out of the picture. But we need infrastructure in health, we need infrastructure in energy. So what's going to happen? Environmental issues have been neglected. I mean, the environmental issues have been considered a distraction. So they have been neglected, and he couldn't care less about it, or that government couldn't care less. Security, the rule of law, the balance of democratic power have not improved and are actually at a lot of risk. The authoritarian shift and militarization and recent reforms to amnesty protection, I mean, I'm very worried about what's happening, and that in general, I mean, our political regime has moved to a much more authoritarian attitude or position. It was never a real democracy as such, but it was whatever we had. Now the attack is on the judicial power. We have three powers, executive, legislative, and the judicial. Legislative independence has vanished with this administration. And now with the election of Claudia, that was great. The election was great for her. I mean, we have a woman, great. We have an engineer, great. He comes from UNAM, great. And that's the end of it, because then I don't know. The rest is that she has been for 40 years working under AMLO. Is there a new Claudia behind that that's going to appear as, Harry Potter? Maybe. I don't know. Will she be able to appear? Maybe. I don't know. López Obrador's reform managed to put in a change in policy in which in the next 3 years there can be a referendum and she can be removed from power. So there's that. The military, López Obrador is very, very powerful. His rate of approval is like 65%, and it's more than Claudia votes, proportion of votes for Claudia. He has said that he's going to retire to his ranch, but he reserves the right to give his opinion on important matters. And he's very willing to help if they ask him to help. So in order to have whatever, forget it. And to conclude on an optimistic note, because you want optimism, there's a poem by Szymborska, which is, after every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road. The corpse-filled wagons can pass, etc., etc. But the important part, the optimistic part, because this is really, really bad, what happens after a war. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his or her mouth, gazing at the clouds. So at the end, there's hope, because after a war, there's a lot of destruction. There's a lot of destruction. There's not a war, but there's a lot of destruction. But as Szymborska says, at the end, there's someone with hope, with a blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. Someone has hope, and we all have hope. And let's keep on having hope. Thank you very much.
Well, so after this very optimistic note from, I saw that Laura was shocked at some point. Maybe she can comment something. Oh, yeah.
She was envious of him.
No, it's good. You make me look optimistic. Okay, maybe I can start with a question then. The first one that I have is, why is he so popular if things are so bad and if he hasn't delivered at all? How come he has 60-something%? Because, I mean, with Lula, when he got re-elected, and even when Dilma Rousseff got elected, which I guess is a comparison that I'm refraining from doing, but there's a lot in the Claudia Sheinbaum story that reminds us of the Dilma Rousseff story. I mean, the more technocrat part of the government, of the popular leader, and we all know what happened with Dilma and the political situation in Brazil. So there is always a risk that something similar happens when, obviously, the whole misogynistic environment has a lot to do with it. So the question here is, why is he so popular? Because in the case of Lula, I think he did deliver, even though with limits. He delivered lower inequality, he delivered less poverty, less extreme poverty, he delivered growth, not substantial levels of growth, but we even had a 7.5% growth rate in 2010. We all... Positive. Well, we also had some negative ones later. But we did have clear social transfers with a big impact, minimum wage policies, and I think that we all attribute the popularity to the economic gains. At least that's the most common explanation. And here, if economic gains were not so substantial, why are the people so happy with him to even vote for Claudia Sheinbaum?
Yeah, that's a great question, but I mean, I don't want to give the impression that everything was bad, because the poverty did go down, and that was the minimum wage has been bragged and drummed every day. Wow, thanks to all, and practically every single positive action by the government is attributed to López Obrador. The pensions that are given by the federal government are López Obrador's pensions. Oh, AMLO gave it to me. And that's one. The other is, I mean, poverty was reduced, etc. And in addition, when you look at the figure of regressive distribution of transfers, if I'm a poor person in the first decile, whether this is regressive or not, I don't know, and I don't care. I just get more money. So, and if this is linked to AMLO, so I think that explains a lot. And in addition, he has a press conference for 3 hours every morning, in which everything that's good is his right, and everything that's bad is part of neoliberalism, the previous ones, etc. So, and he speaks, he speaks the language of the people as such. He never talks about the super multiplier, as far as I remember, but that may change. I don't. Neither does Lula. Well, perhaps he's so popular, and I don't know why he's That's are the reasons that I believe. If you look, funny enough, if you look at the surveys on popularity of AMLO, rate of approval, they are great. But the same people that answer those surveys when they are asked about economic policies independently, except for the minimum wage, they say that things are not good. So it's just faith. It's just this man that, I mean, he's a great politician, and the way the other politicians have acted before and still act, it's just like, well, what else?
Thanks for your great presentation. I have many ideas. I try to put, I hope I can. Some facts: Latin American country has managed to avoid financial crisis, accumulating international reserves and increasing domestic rates. Many countries has applied fiscal rule that you say. So the only thing to growth, as Laura explained, is to increase taxes. That is kind of very difficult, as always colleagues say. The progressive government didn't remove these rules, so I'm not optimistic. It looks like a stagnation trend. So the first question is, in which extent, the issue of fiscal rules, in which extent this is a problem of financial deficit of the public sector, not the primary deficit, except for this year that you show, Juan Carlos, it looks like superávit. So if it's like this, for me it looks like the old story, the story of the financial dependency and the external constraints as the issue. So I wanted to make the question that you did yesterday. If not, where is the external constraint? But we are with the stagnations, Latin America countries didn't grow. So some ideas about that. This is the whole story, the financial dependency. What do you think, both of you? Thank you.
No, you start. No, I talk too much. No. He's asking me. I'm sorry. I'll try to be brief and give him the mic. So I don't. So the situation is heterogeneous for different countries in Latin America, right? And I think the question of international reserves that you touched is core in terms of not only international reserves but external debt. The level of external debt relative to total debt. I think it's what can be really a division here of the countries that do face some external constraint and those that don't, right? And in that sense, I would say that Brazil and Mexico are both in the most comfortable side of the spectrum of Latin American economies, right? None of these countries are facing a problem of external debt, and therefore I don't see at the moment a problem of balance of payments constraint or external constraints as we do see in Argentina, for example, right? Or Ecuador or other economies in the region. So I think that creates a big difference in the way we analyze the prospects and the possibilities. But still, the story of financial dependency is there, and I think when it comes to monetary policy and the ability and the room of maneuver for monetary policy in the entire region, I think the story that Juan Carlos Moreno-Brid just told me and told us, and the story of Lula or the story of Dilma or others, they all have something in common, which is the currency appreciation, the currency volatility in this period, and the lack of space for central banks to actually lower interest rates in a sustainable way. And I think that has very much to do with how volatile capital inflows are and how still connected to the international financial system in ways that reduce the level of autonomy of monetary policy very significantly. And we're seeing this now. And I think, you know, the comment on what is the first thing you look at, Obrador looks at being the nominal exchange rate, I think this is the common pattern of all Latin American countries. We all see how the news pay attention to nominal exchange rates. And I have to say, the first thing I do when I look at the Brazilian real and see it has devalued is actually Google the Mexican peso and to see if they also devalued, because that usually is the case, and that explains that it's not anything to do with our own domestic policies. It's something that is coming from abroad. So I think that's the main issue we all face, and without capital controls or without some collective way of reducing volatility in exchange rate markets, I think we'll all in the region be facing a big constraint. That is not a balance of payments constraint, but it's an inflation problem, right? It's a nominal anchor to inflation problem.
Thank you. She's brilliant, and she also gave me time to think, not to be as brilliant, but anyway. Yes, if you look at the figures of fiscal balance, the primary balance has been deteriorating with López Obrador, not a lot, but the overall balance has been deteriorating much faster, which means that the interest or payments related to debt, interest and repayments are a problem. But going back to what Julia presented before, I mean, our tax rate is very, very low. So, I mean, in this, if you are not going to increase taxes and to do it in a very progressive way, etc., then we do have a problem with finance in the sense of the fiscal constraint. So, but we do have a fiscal constraint, which is a political constraint that, I mean, López Obrador, he himself, a left-wing government, supposedly, has alluded to use the most important tool for redistribution, which is tax policy and spending policy. So that's a fiscal constraint, which self-imposed fiscal constraint, which in addition, given what Laura was saying, our monetary policy implies an interest rate which is very high, which we're not able to reduce because then there will be a problem with capital flight or with net capital movements. And this was evident with the elections in Mexico. Claudia was elected, nothing happened to the peso. Then we discovered that Morena's, as a party, has more than 66% of both chambers, which means that Morena, the ruling party, can do any type of changes in the constitution without asking the judges. So at that moment, the peso devalued from like 14% in one day. And then everybody knows, or everybody says, that there's a period of volatility in the exchange rate that is being, has opened. Some people say that, oh, well, it's only 60 days till Claudia arrives in power. And I always remind them of John Reed, an American that wrote a beautiful book, 10 Days That Shook the World. Talk about the Russian Revolution in 10 days. I mean, 60 days in Mexico, it's not going to be a revolution, but a financial instability can happen any day. And in addition, FDI, exports as a source of growth, has disappeared as a source of growth. Partly because of the exchange rate, partly because the linkages of the export sector to the rest of the economy are weak, very weak. So if we don't have a new industrial policy, more active, et cetera, with energy and green, et cetera, I don't see where are the sources of growth. Claudia could do that, and Harry Potter could also do that, and lots of people could do that. But the problem with Claudia is not Claudia herself. If the party is so powerful, what can Claudia really do when López Obrador has said himself that tax reform is corrupt? I mean, why need to tax? It's the problem that Claudia has is not Claudia. It's whether Claudia, whatever she wants to do, will she be able to, if she wants to do something different from López Obrador. But at a certain moment, Claudia, with or without López Obrador, will have to enact a fiscal reform, a very profound fiscal reform. There's no way of avoiding that. And I don't know about other things, but industrial policy would also be needed. And the issue of social policy, I mean, we're far away from the universal social protection. What we're doing is basically, well, neoliberal if you want. He has said that, say, for example, the program for childcare. There was a program of the government for childcare. And that was canceled by the government. And he said that grandmothers should take care of the grandkids. I said, wow. So, I mean, very progressive. There's a need of change, and I hope that Claudia does that. The last row, just one more question.
Yeah, so, Professor...
many questions.
Yeah, so he has...
Many questions and answers.
Well, congratulations, Laura and Juan Carlos, for these beautiful presentations. I think Claudia may have one more problem apart from the other ones, another one. Lula last year started his government with a good exchange rate, right, Laura? 5 something per real. And in Mexico, 5 years ago, I went to Mexico and I got 20 pesos for $1. And now it's 17. 18 and all. So anyway, what's going to happen with the exchange rate? As there is a promise that minimum wage will go up, raised according to inflation, whatever happens to the exchange rate will go to the salary too. So isn't this a problem? What is the discussion in Mexico about this? Because this means very high interest rates in order to avoid capital flight.
I think maybe if there is one final question, Santiago and Guilherme, maybe, yeah? Yeah, quick questions, yeah.
I think that the parallelism between Lula and Dilma and AMLO and Claudia also can be told through the history, through a story about the fiscal policy. Because Dilma self-inflicted a fiscal policy that start a recession. So I want to know your opinion about why they take this kind of decision. Maybe they never assist to an international workshop on demand-led growth. But what is going on through these decisions? And also for Juan Carlos, what do you expect about the fiscal promise that Claudia made about to decrease the fiscal deficit about 3.5% of GDP in the next year? Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to be quick since we have a few time. To Juan Carlos, I think you gave a hint that you don't believe that exports can be a good source of growth in Mexico. I would like to understand a little bit more. In particularly, I think there's a big difference when we talk about most Latin American economies. We talk about commodity price cycles to describe their situation. I think Mexico is less vulnerable to these cycles, or more independent from commodity prices to define its its policy space. But on the other side, maybe the demand from the US might be important, plays an important role on the dynamics of exports. So maybe you can talk about this and how do you think this will develop in the next period?
So if you can give your final word. Now I'll give her room to think. She doesn't need it, but I'll give her room. Answering to the first question of the discussion, Ricardo, is so much more acute and sad that although you're right, it's like, well, let's see what happens with minimum wages and inflation is right now all the rule of law, violence, the military, organized crime, whether we're going to have now judges in Mexico appointed by popular consultation. All judges in Mexico in the next 2 months must resign or must wait for a consultation by the people, the honest people, whether this guy or this woman will be the judge or not. So we're very worried about that. Inflation is not so, at this moment, is not so much of a concern except in the Bank of Mexico because it's rising a little bit, 4.1 to 4.3, but we don't see inflation right now as a big problem. And since we were managed to increase the real wage in 100% and nothing really happened, many people think that, well, it can keep on increasing at the same rate of inflation and nothing will happen. That's one. The other question about why, Santiago, that he said about why do they, what does López Obrador or Lula, or not Lula, but Dilma, well, I would like to go to Keynes, that madmen and women in authority hear the voices of defunct economists. And so AMLO doesn't hear the voice of Keynes or not to mention other economists and this Minsky, whatever. But Hayek, the voices that he hears are those that he believes in austerity, he believes in, tighten the belt, etc. And the other one of Guillermo, oh dear, I don't know what to say. May you repeat the last part of the question?
The dynamics of US demand.
Yes. Well, again, we're very happy to have that, except that Trump is going to appear in the scenery, and Trump has said that his tax reform is going to be eliminate the IRA, not the IRA, the IRA, the other one, no, the revenue, no? The income tax, IRS, the IRA is another one, no? The one is the Rifle Association, I think. The NRA. He's going to eliminate the income tax and substitute it by taxes on exports to Mexico or imports to Mexico, etc., whatever. So I don't know what will happen with that part. It's very difficult to be so close to the United States. We have a big problem on migration and on violence. Right now, the number of people that we are arresting or putting in jail or putting in caution, whatever, custody, it has more than tripled from the last year. And so we send people or we don't send people and we receive arms. I mean, it's a very difficult relation. Laura was saying that conflict is great, or conflict can be a source of inspiration. And well, it's obvious that she lives far away from the United States, because we get very inspired, but we get very depressed at the same time.
So, yeah, if Laura doesn't have a final word, maybe we can close this session with a round of applause to the speakers. Yeah, so it's always great to compare Latin American countries, and let's hope that this inspires many research, comparative research in the future and so on.